For 3 uninterrupted decades, Johnny Carson invited America to settle in. He was the everyman's MC, affable, unflappable, a metronome of timing who could turn a pause into a punchline. But beneath the velvet cadence and effortless charm, Carson carried the hush of 1,000 whispers. He knew which publicity romances were manufactured, which smiling marriages were insurance policies, and which guests walked on stage with a different truth folded into their breast pockets. Johnny knew, said those who worked near the hot lights and cue cards. He knew the choreography of deception that studios rehearsed for the public, the hand-holding photographed outside eateries, the conveniently timed engagements, the carefully worded magazine profiles that converted rumor into narrative. And if one story encapsulated that delicate, nerve-shredding balancing act, it was the case of the era's most polished heartthrob, a man whose on-screen romances stirred box offices and fan letters alike, even as his real life was guarded with the vigilance of a state secret. Number 1. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy Hollywood still tells the Hepburn-Tracy romance like a lullaby. 26 years of devotion, whispered in dressing rooms and lit by hospital lamps near the end. It is a beautiful story, enduring, noble, complicated. And yet, Carson knew that what the public consumed as a love epic could also be understood as a brilliant arrangement that soothed a judgmental era and gave 2 towering talents room to breathe. Tracy, devout and troubled, needed a respectful explanation the world would accept. Hepburn, independent, flinty, and uninterested in the required pageantry of public romance, needed cover to live on her own unfettered terms. Carson admired Hepburn in particular, the trousers, the unapologetic intellect, the self-possession that rearranged a room's gravity. He could see how she'd carved a life that smuggled something honest into a dishonest system. The legend of their romance, polished smooth by time and retelling, did what legends do. It protected, distracted, and conferred dignity, but it also obscured complexities, relationships, and affinities that didn't fit a nation's narrow template for acceptable love. The result? A tale so satisfying that few thought to question what it omitted, even while it granted both stars the privacy they demanded and deserved. Number 2. Marlene Dietrich strode onto stages with an aura that made categories seem quaint. The suits, the low voice, the imperious glamour. Her public image didn't defy gender so much as dissolve it into style. Carson admired the way she converted what would have been scandal for a stateside star into allure for a European one. The marriage that functioned, the open secrets tucked just out of reach, the unapologetic appetite for life. She refined ambiguity into currency. In conversation, she was composed the way a blade is polished, reflective, sharp, thrilling to watch as it catches the light. Carson recognized the elegance of her solution. Rather than deny, she stylized. Rather than confess, she suggested. She made the very thing that could have been used to destroy her into the engine of her appeal. It was a kind of honesty through indirection, a signal to those who could see, a sophisticated fiction for those who could not. Number 3. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester. Some marriages in the studio era were press releases, others were intricate treaties drafted to solve multiple problems elegantly. Laughton and Lanchester's union belonged to the latter category, a partnership that lasted decades, survived every weather, and produced a surface story the public found entirely plausible. Carson approached Lanchester with affection when she appeared post-Laughton. She was witty, guarded, and a master of diversion. He could feel the lines she would not cross, the memories that would remain allegorical rather than explicit. What impressed him wasn't the deception, it was the mutuality. 2 brilliant performers, both with their own private orientations and needs, created a structure that let them work, thrive, and protect each other. In a town addicted to melodrama, they curated something sturdier than romance. Solidarity. Carson understood that distinction. It reframed the moral lens. What looks like artifice from the outside can function as care on the inside. Number 4. Marlon Brando. If any actor symbolized authenticity, it was Brando, a storm under skin, a new grammar for American performance. He arrived with an energy that bulldozed the antique furniture of old Hollywood line readings. Carson respected his artistry and, like many, felt the volatility behind it. The paradox fascinated him, how the avatar of cinematic truth could also field strip his personal life for public consumption, laying out only the parts everyone expected to see while keeping the rest under lock. Interviews with Brando were unpredictable. Funny, thorny, evasive, disarming. Carson sensed the latitude Brando had painstakingly created for himself, the mask of louche straightness that let him operate in peace while pushing cultural edges an inch at a time. In a tide pool like mid-century Hollywood, even half gestures toward honesty were radical. The disconnect between what Brando revealed on film and what he withheld from a public that felt entitled to everything wasn't hypocrisy. It was the geometry of survival in an era that policed desire with an iron ruler. Number 5. James Dean never sat across from Carson. Fate intervened long before. But the stories followed him like contrails. To Carson, Dean's mythology was a prism that showed how Hollywood metabolizes scandal when the subject cannot answer. The whispers about mentorships and transactions, about the grim economics of power and access, were not new to the town. What struck Carson was how death froze Dean at the height of photogenic defiance and turned everything unresolved into romance. The public could hold contradictory narratives without having to reconcile them because the star had already become a mural. The tragedy in Dean's legend, beyond the lost years, was how easily a human being becomes a symbol others sculpt. Carson saw the cautionary tale plainly. In life, the same rumors might have strangled a career. In death, they became part of the mystique. Hollywood, he concluded, has a way of turning pain into lacquer when there's money to be made and a story to protect. Number 6. Rock Hudson Rock. Hudson embodied what studio publicity departments believed American desire looked like. He was height and bone structure, ease and grin, a gentlemanly presence that made the screen smell faintly of aftershave and fresh linen. On Carson's couch, Hudson radiated the same gentle humor that made him bankable. But behind the cameras, every sentence was a tightrope. Carson understood the silent peril. For an actor like Hudson, whose livelihood depended on women believing the fantasy, one errant question could become a match in a warehouse of dry straw. Hollywood's machine had engineered a biography that could withstand inspection from suburban living rooms, studio-approved girlfriends, a marriage that quieted the most aggressive gossip columns, and a public persona calibrated to precision. Carson, ever the consummate host, let the fiction breathe. He'd guide the conversation into safe harbors while mentally cataloging all the reefs just under the surface, career-ending reefs that both men, in their different ways, had learned to chart around. Interviews became a choreography of care, a smile here, a topic change there, a laugh at the right moment to float past danger. The price of that choreography, on Hudson and on those tasked with maintaining the illusion, was incalculable. The arc ended in tragedy and cultural shock, and Carson felt the aftershocks in his bones. A system had forced a man to live a sliced-in-two life, and the host, too, had played a role in keeping the halves from ever touching. Number 7. Cary Grant. Cary Grant wasn't simply a star, he was a definition. Tailored suits, immaculate posture, that accent like glass over water. The public adored the cultivated perfection. In private, Carson marveled at the distance between Grant the myth and the man who navigated companionship on his own terms. Bachelor Hall, that shared beach home with Randolph Scott, wasn't a rumor to those who circulated behind studio gates. It was a reality the machinery politely explained away. Publicity photos of two handsome actors flipping eggs and matching robes. Why, just economy. Two friends sharing a place near the ocean. Carson would talk with Grant about this role or that director, about marriages that came and went, and feel the uncanny friction of interviewing an icon whose greatest work might have been the character he played off camera. Cary Grant himself. It wasn't charade, it was survival. In a time when authenticity could end a bankable career, the persona functioned like armor. The line between role and reality blurred not because of dishonesty, but because of necessity. Carson sympathized with the psychic cost, the vigilance, the perpetual alignment of stories, the posture required to carry a single carefully engineered identity across decades and not let it splinter under the strain. Number 8. Raymond Burr. Raymond Burr's characters fought for truth. Perry Mason was a weekly homily on reason and justice, a ritual that reassured millions that facts, properly assembled, would prevail. The man who embodied that ritual lived with a secret so tender and so endangered that he built an entire parallel biography to protect it. Marriages that could not be confirmed, military exploits that left no records, a tragedy involving a child that, upon examination, dissolved like sugar in hot water. It wasn't a prank on the public, it was a barricade against scrutiny. Carson saw the ache in that barricade. He wasn't interviewing a person so much as a carefully drafted dossier. The labor of it, the memory required to maintain a narrative with multiple moving parts, must have been exhausting. And yet Burr also made a private life rich with partnership and work and quiet joys that didn't require studio permission. The split, full public visibility and full private concealment, was the logic of the time crystallized in a single human story. Carson could only imagine the relief that must have followed when, after Burr's passing, the record began to reflect the truth of the life actually lived. Number 9. Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power's face did more than sell tickets. It supplied a template for fantasy. He moved through swashbucklers and dramas the way a chorus moves through harmony, effortlessly, inevitably. For men like Power, the studio system provided a gilded track and 1,000 watchers stationed along it. Beauty was the passport that opened every door and the prison that forbade detours. Carson, hearing the insider tales, grasped the ritualized compartmentalization, public appearances that sustained the illusion, private hours guarded with military discipline. The paradox sat plainly in front of him. The more an industry monetized a man's desirability, the less freedom he possessed to define it on his own terms. The stakes resembled a wire pulled as tight as a violin string. One false note, one photograph framed badly, and the sound could break. Power's early death locked his image in a timeless room, sparing him the culture wars to come, but also denying him the loosenings history would deliver later. Carson was not a confessor, and The Tonight Show was not church. He was, by training and temperament, the steward of a national bedtime story. Still, as the years unfurled, he counted the costs. What does it mean to spend a career keeping company with people you won't like, people you admire, while pretending not to hear the most fragile parts of their lives banging like pipes behind the wall? In the 1950s and 60s, even into the 70s and 80s, those pipes weren't merely inconvenient. They were dangerous. Careers, reputations, livelihoods, entire futures hung on the continued operation of the make-believe. Looking back, he could distinguish malice from mechanism. The malice seldom belonged to the stars. It resided in the rigid morality that policed them, in the gossip economy that punished deviation, in the hypocrisy that demanded glamour while criminalizing the desire that often fuels it. The mechanism, studio PR, carefully planted items, choreographed appearances, was a lumbering machine fed by fear and money. Carson had done what one does when standing too close to heavy gears. You keep your sleeves rolled and your hands clear. You learn where not to put pressure. But age clarifies. He understood that he had been part of a system that demanded fictions and paid handsomely for them, then punished the people those fictions were designed to protect. He had admired his guests for their talent. Later, he admired them for their endurance, for walking a wire while millions watched and never once being allowed to say the balancing pole was heavy. Across these stories runs a single braided thread. The American entertainment industry trained the public to fall in love with cardboard silhouettes and then worked furiously to keep the human beings in those silhouettes out of sight. Lavender marriages were not merely contracts, they were survival plans. Carefully staged interviews were not lies, they were shields. And the rumors that rustled for decades were not gossip so much as the awkward sound of a nation learning, slowly and painfully, to look beyond its own mirror. The stars in these accounts lived with a double gravity, the pull of fame and the pull of truth. To exist in both fields at once required ingenuity, sometimes flinty defiance, sometimes pragmatic compromise, often both. Carson watched them calibrate their lives with an engineer's precision, every angle considered, every variable weighted. The miracle, if you want to call it that, is how much art they managed to make under those conditions. Performances that still ignite, line deliveries that still catch fire in the chest. They carried the secrets and still did the work. That duality moved him most of all. What changes when secrecy becomes history rather than policy? Perspective, for one. Some revelations land like indictments, but over time, many begin to read like rescue notes passed between people trapped in the same locked room. The audience changes too. A newer public, raised with language that did not exist in mid-century America, revisits the old publicity shots and sees what the first audience could not. Tenderness where the captions said friendship, orchestration where the captions said romance, strategy where the captions said scandal. Carson, for his part, came to believe that empathy is a form of accuracy. If you cannot tell the whole story, at least you can refuse to tell it cruelly. He could not unlock the door on camera, not then. But as he spoke more freely in private, he named the pattern out loud, a world where survival demanded invention, and where invention, worn long enough, becomes a second skin. He never confused the second skin for a sin. He recognized it for what it was, a garment tailored by necessity and stitched by fear, which later generations might finally remove. Late-night television is supposed to evaporate by morning. The monologue dissolves into the clatter of breakfast dishes. The skits become anecdotes in office hallways. The interviews fade into a general feeling of having been kept company. Yet some conversations don't evaporate. They linger because of what was not said. Carson knew that silence can be the loudest sound on stage. He worked with it the way a skilled musician works with rests. In those rests, a coded compassion lived. And so, as the cameras cooled and the band packed up and the city uncoiled from its nightly performance, the host sat with the ledger only he could see. The jokes told, the truths dodged, the reputations guarded by omission. He couldn't change the era he served, but he could, with time, put words to what it demanded from the people it crowned. Dignity despite pretense, courage despite danger, work, always work, despite the wire underfoot. These stories of a matinee idol carrying an invented biography like a shield, of a gentleman building a persona that could move through rooms unharmed, of a lioness who smuggled honesty into trousers, of rebels who sold the world an image while protecting a life. The stories look different now than they did in black and white. They look simply human. The point was never to unmask for sport. It was to understand the cost of the mask and the grace of the person wearing it. Johnny Carson knew. He chose not to break what he could not repair. And in his later years, as the fog around those decades began to lift, he found the language to honor the truth without erasing the survival. That, at last, feels like a kind of justice for the people he introduced to America, with a smile and a hand wave, and a gentleness the public never even realized was there.